Well, it's good to be here worshiping the Lord with you. We have a number of students and teens up in Duluth at our district youth conference, and I'd ask that you be praying for them as they're getting ready to head home. Pray that the Lord would kind of cement in their souls the things that they've learned and hopefully some of the decisions for the Lord that they've made. We're going to continue our series in the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 7 this morning. We'll be starting there, so if you have a copy of God's Word, Revelation chapter 7. Well, it was 1970 when Stevie Wonder belted out the now famous line, "Here I am, baby, signed, sealed, delivered, I'm yours. You got my future in your hands." I'm not sure what Mr. Wonder intended when he wrote that famous line. I don't really know what else is in that song, but I do know that Mr. Wonder probably didn't know, but should or could have known if he'd read Revelation 7, that that song is a perfect summary of the message in Revelation chapter 7. Signed by God? Check. Sealed by God? Check. Delivered by God? I mean, it's all in there. Here's our main point this morning. God protects his people. So we're going to read the first 8 verses of Revelation chapter 7, and then we're going to unpack it in 3 parts. So let's dive right in and read this passage. Here it is, Revelation 7, starting in verse 1. "After this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, restraining the 4 winds of the earth, so that no wind could blow on the earth or on the sea or on any tree. Then I saw another angel rising up out of the east who had the seal of the living God. He cried out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who were allowed to harm the earth and the sea, 'Don't harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we seal the servants of our God on their foreheads.' And I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the Israelites, 12,000 sealed from the tribe of Judah, 12,000 from the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 from the tribe of Gad, 12,000 from the tribe of Asher, 12,000 from the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000 from the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000 from the tribe of Simeon, 12,000 from the tribe of Levi, 12,000 from the tribe of Issachar, 12,000 from the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000 from the tribe of Joseph, 12,000 sealed from the tribe of Benjamin." 3 parts this morning. Here's the first one. Sealing prepares the earth for judgment. The first 2 words of this passage, "after this." Now, if you were reading the book of Revelation like a story, you would think that after this was talking about events that were happening after the events that had just concluded in Revelation chapter 6. So what happened in Revelation chapter 6? Well, the sky was rolled up like a scroll. Every mountain and island was moved from its place. The earth was rocketing toward its conclusion. So you would assume that after this would come the end. But we don't get the end of the world as we know it in chapter 7. Instead, we get a glimpse of the people of God. So the after this is probably not after the events of chapter 6. So then what is the after this? Well, after this, I saw. So John is probably giving us the sequencing, not of world history, but of how he saw his visions about how history was going to unfold. So the next vision that John saw was this. This is probably flashback imagery. Have you watched a TV show where the scenes are unfolding and then all of a sudden it just randomly shows you something that happened 5 years ago? And it's a flashback because it's needed context so you understand the motivation and the reasoning of the characters, why they're doing what they're doing. That's probably what's happening here in Revelation 7. We're flashing back to before the horsemen, before the seal judgments. Why do I say that? 2 reasons I think this has to be the case. The first reason is just literary logic. I mean, look at verse 3. "Don't harm the earth or the sea or the trees until," okay. But chapter 6, "every mountain and island was moved from its place and the sky was spread apart like a scroll." Like the earth and the sea and the trees were pretty well harmed by the end of chapter 6. So if we're going to say don't harm them until, we got to be flashbacking to something that happened previously. So I think what John is doing is he's giving us, like he has throughout the book of Revelation, clues that he's basing his vision on the Old Testament. Specifically here, the Old Testament precedent is in Zechariah chapter 6 and verse 5. And the angel answered and said to me, "These are the four winds of heaven, which go forth from standing before the Lord of all the earth." So what do we have in Revelation 7? We have a bunch of fours. We have four winds. We have four corners of the earth. We have four angels. Where do all these fours come from? Well, the Old Testament precedent here, the four winds of heaven in Zechariah. And in Zechariah, it becomes pretty clear that Zechariah's horsemen, his four horsemen, and his four winds are the same thing. And so these four horsemen in Revelation 6, representing the first six seals, the first four marks of judgment, these are what had been predicted in the Old Testament. The four winds are the four horsemen. Their devastation is restrained until the saints are sealed. We have these four horsemen who are going to come, and they're standing at the four corners of the earth. Now, the four corners of the earth, that's not a flat earth argument, as though you can literally look at the earth like a rectangle. There's boom, 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 four corners. No, it's biblical language that's saying every place in the universe is under the control of God. There's not a place you can go in all creation where God doesn't reign. It's based on Ezekiel chapter 7 and verse 2. Son of man, this is what the Lord God says. The end has come to the four corners of the earth. So four winds from four corners. Well, all of that actually is also based on the Old Testament. Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 36 says this: "I will bring the four winds from the four corners of the heavens, and I will scatter them to all these winds." So here's the point. God has authority over the entire earth. The judgment that's coming will cover the entire earth because God's sovereign over the entire earth. Now, it's super interesting. In ancient Mesopotamia, there were some kings, and these kings, like Naram-Sin was one of them, that gave themselves the royal title, King of the Four Corners of the Earth. That's a pompous, pretentious title, and God's like, you know what? You're not that. God's relieving these kings of their assumed authority and rule by reminding them that he is in control of every place where his creation extends. And here's where it gets interesting. What God is about to do is in response to the prayers of his people. Revelation chapter 6. Do you remember the saints under the altar crying out in a loud voice, "Lord, the one who is holy and true, how long until you judge those who live on the earth and avenge our blood?" The key there is they cried out in a loud voice. Fast forward here to Revelation chapter 7. This angel rises up from the east, and he cries out in a loud voice. Here's what's going to happen. God's judgment is his response to the prayers of his people. We face these hard times in life. God, how long am I going to have to deal with this sickness and suffering? God, how long am I going to have to deal with this relational strain? God, how long am I going to have to deal with these unfair people that are judging me wrongly? God, how long? I don't know what your circumstance is, but how long? We keep crying out. And God's answer is, I'm coming. And God's coming in judgment. And you're like, that doesn't sound like the answer I wanted. Like we read about all these judgments in Revelation, and we're like, I'm not sure your judgment is the answer to my prayer for peace and comfort and stability. Like you're saying all these problems are happening, so I'm going to go judge the world. Well, there's a clue in the text that we miss in the English. It talks about this angel rising up from the east. But the Greek doesn't say from the east. It says from the rising of the sun. Now, since we know the sun rises in the east, most of the English versions say from the east, but from the rising of the sun is actually an allusion back to the Old Testament, to Malachi chapter 4 and verse 2. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings. So get this. The judgment that God is bringing on the earth is healing for the people of God. Why? Because God is going to use that judgment to wipe wickedness out of this earth and purify this earth so that it can become the new creation, the new heavens, and the new earth where righteousness will live forever. God is preparing a place where we can dwell with him forever, and the only way that can happen is for evil to be washed away. And so God's judgments are good long-term for his people. You're like, but they sound really scary. I'm not sure I want to deal with all these judgments. Good news, don't harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we seal the servants of our God on their foreheads. God's people are marked out before the judgments come so that they can be preserved through the judgments in preparation for the healing that God is preparing in the new heavens and the new earth. Like that's what Revelation is talking about. Here's the good news. God will not dump you into a situation that you cannot handle. In his commentary on Revelation, writing on this chapter, Lewis Brighton says this: in each Christian's life, in each Christian community and church, God restrains the horrors represented by the horsemen until each Christian and each church are mature and ready by his Spirit to meet the onslaughts of the world as they carry out Christ's mission on earth. God marks his people to preserve his people as he prepares the world to be judged. And you're thinking, okay, but like half the verses we just read like an identification list. And it sure sounded like Old Testament language, like Israelite tribes. So who are these people of God that are being sealed so that they won't face the judgment? Are these Israelites who aren't going to face judgment, or is something else going on? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's part 2 that we need to look at here in this message. So we saw that sealing prepares the earth for judgment. Next, we want to see that sealing presents the true people of God, it identifies who these people are. So Revelation chapter 7 builds off a pattern in the book of Revelation that first began in chapter 5. In chapter 5, John sees this vision of the throne room in heaven, and he hears about a lion, but he sees a slaughtered lamb. This hearing but seeing pattern comes about again in Revelation chapter 7. In the first part of the chapter, verses 1 to 8, he hears about the sealed from the tribes of Israel, the 144,000. But then he sees in verse 9 through the end of this chapter a grand throng, a multitude of people surrounding God's throne in heaven. And if the pattern holds, in chapter 5, he heard about a lion, saw a lamb, and they were the same person. He hears about the 144,000. He sees this great throng. Likely they are the same group as well. So here's the pattern. In verses 1 to 8, we get the earthly perspective of this group of people. We see them presented as the heirs of Israel's promises. These are God's people on earth, and we're going to call them the church militant, the church presented as an army. I'll tell you why in just a second. In verses 9 to 17, we get the heavenly perspective. This is God's people as the multi-ethnic throng around the throne, and this is the church triumphant in heaven. But the question is, who are these people? Who get sealed? Well, the text tells us the servants of our God. Now, 11 other times this term servant is used in the book of Revelation to describe God's people. And every other time, all 11 of those uses, the servants of God describe all of God's people, Jew and Gentile, from every time, every place, who will believe in Jesus Christ. In fact, each message to the 7 churches, remember how the whole letter was structured around these letters to the 7 churches? And remember, there were promises to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give this. To the one who conquers, I will give this. Like those who belong to Christ are those who conquer. But remember the promise to the church of Philadelphia in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 12. The one who conquers, I will write on him the name of my God. That's a beautiful promise. So, I'm suggesting that the 144,000 here are the conquerors who have their names written, who have God's name written on their foreheads. Revelation chapter 14, verse 1 seems to confirm this. Check out Revelation 14:1. Then I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. So we combine the writing of the name from Revelation 3 for the conquerors and the sealing of the foreheads of the 144,000 servants, and in 14:1 it seems to come together. The conquerors are the servants. The ones who live for God are the ones who are sealed. So the list in verses 4 to 8 of all these people from all these tribes is the church presented as the end times fulfillment of what Israel was supposed to be, the true people of God. But I told you we call them the church militant. Why is that? Because this framing of a tribalist like this, from the tribe of, from the tribe of, from the tribe of, this pattern comes out of Numbers chapter 1. And in Numbers chapter 1, the nation of Israel takes a census of the people to see how many dudes there are who can go be in the army. And it's really interesting because the nation of Israel was physically conquering territory in the promised land in Canaan as an army. But now in Revelation, the saints are presented as an army. But here's the thing. We're not going out with swords and spears and AK-47s and trying to conquer the world as in convert or die. That's kind of the Islamic version of how to take over the world. No, we're not doing that. We're going out to conquer with the gospel. The church's mission is to conquer as person after person after person repents of their sin, believes in Jesus Christ, and is transformed by the Spirit of God as they place their faith in God. So who gets sealed? All those from all places across all times who hear, accept, and believe the gospel. They become part of the people of God. So here's the thing, church. Your weapon is your witness. And how you face the trials that come through the horsemen that are going out, right? All this disaster that's overtaking the world until Jesus returns, how you face this sickness and this death, all of it is your witness. And here's the thing, Christians live differently because we've been sealed. Right? If we're sealed and we belong to God and we've got his name on our forehead, shouldn't we live as those who belong to God? Like if we're marked by him, shouldn't our life scream out his name? Christians view things differently. Christians view money differently. We view money as a tool to bless and to give so that others can be relieved of suffering, not as something to be hoarded, as a competition to see who can have more in their bank account. Christians view sickness differently. You know, I hear often from Christians facing a chronic or even terminal disease who are like, I got the chance to tell my nurse about Jesus. I was smiling so much because of who the Lord is that my doctor noticed. You know how many non-Christians are like, I was in my hotel room just so happy that people around me knows. I've never heard one non-Christian say that. But Christians view sickness differently. It's an opportunity to share who Jesus is to us. Only a Christian like John Piper could get diagnosed with cancer and write a book called Don't Waste Your Cancer. The world views it so different. And by the way, Christians view death differently. The world's like, death is the thing to be avoided. We're like, death is a doorway to eternal life. Unbelievers are like, death is the worst thing that can happen. We're like, death is going to be defeated by Jesus Christ one day. Death is a temporary reality. We view death differently because Jesus beat death for us. Christians view time differently. Unbelievers say, go have as much fun as you can for as long as you can until the clock runs out. We say, make the most of every opportunity to live your life for the glory of God. Invest every moment because it's an opportunity to live for God. I'll give you one more. Christians view politics differently. Unbelievers are like, everything rests on who's in power. I saw a video just this week of a conservative speaker out in California giving a speech, and there was some person that didn't think this person should be speaking and just starts screaming at the top of their lungs and swearing and carrying on, and campus police have to come out and literally grab them by their wrists and their ankles and carry them out. And I'm like, yeah, here's the thing. When you're screaming that loudly, and it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're screaming about, but when you're screaming that loudly, you're telling me that your hope is about who's in power. And I believe that the scriptures are true, and I think Christians believe this, that the heart of the king is in the hands of the Lord, and he can turn it wherever he wants. So it doesn't ultimately matter who's in control because God is in control of everything. And so yes, do we pray? Do we plan? Do we vote? Of course we do. But we trust God as the foundation of it all. Our hope is not in who wins the election. Yes, we have hopes about who wins the election, but our hope is in the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So God's people are sealed to become a witnessing group, and that witness should draw people to faith as they see how we live for God. There are some who object to all this, though, and they're like, okay, but, this is a really specific list. Like it says 12,000 from this tribe, and that sounds really specific. And there are some who would say these 12,000 from each tribe, 144,000 total, are a literal group of Jewish people who are going to be specially sealed just before the end times so that these 144,000 Jews get special protection from just the last little bit of human history. So, how do I respond to the claim that this must be literal Israel? Well, I have three answers to say that this is the church presented as Israel instead of literal Israel. Let me tell you my three reasons why it has to be symbolic language, the church presented as Israel. Here's the first one. This is getting super technical, but look at the tribe names, verse 6 and verse 8. We see the tribe of Manasseh in verse 6 and the tribe of Joseph in verse 8. So we got to go back and talk about the family tree of Israel, right? Abraham had Isaac. Isaac, he had Jacob. Jacob had the 12 tribes, and Joseph was one of those 12 sons of Jacob. Joseph ended up having two sons that we know of, and those two sons were Manasseh and Ephraim. And, well, here's where it gets interesting. wouldn't you expect that if we were going to talk about Joseph's kids, we would have the tribe of Ephraim and the tribe of Manasseh? But we don't get Ephraim at all. We just get Joseph and Manasseh, which, as best as I can tell from my limited knowledge of genealogical studies, are the same group of people. Like, it's one generation removed, and everybody after that is pretty much the same. Like, if we wanted to make a differentiation, we would have talked about the other son. So that's our first clue that this isn't super literal. Of course, then some of you were asking, you're like, so if Manasseh, one of Joseph's sons, shows up, and there's 12 names in this list, and there's 12 tribes, like, did somebody get booted from the tribe list, one of the original 12 tribes? I'm glad you caught that. Yes, that exactly happened. Which is another clue why it's not literal, but you're like, which tribe got the boot? And the answer is Dan. And you're like, what did Dan do? Well, here's what Dan did. The book of Judges tells us what Dan did. Back in Judges chapter 18, it says, the Danites set up the carved image for themselves. What was Dan, the tribe of Dan, known for? They were the idol-worshiping tribe. Not a great thing to be known for. In fact, there were some books written between the time of the Old Testament and the New Testament, apocryphal literature, you might call that. One of those books was called The Testament of Dan. And two quotes from that book that I think are really interesting. Quote, your prince is Satan. Quote, in the last days, you, Dan, will defect from the Lord. So you're like, yikes. Kind of explains why Dan got the boot. In fact, it also makes sense in the context of the book of Revelation. Because remember what the 7 churches in Asia were being tempted to do? They were tempted to defect from their faithfulness to God to worship Caesar, the Roman gods, so that they could share in the economy, so that they wouldn't face potential prosecution by governors or even Caesar himself. They were tempted toward false worship. And even in the tribe list, there's an example of the tribe who was known for false worship gets blotted out. It's as though John is subtly communicating to the people who would have known these names, if you defect from the Lord and embrace false worship, you're not part of the true people of God. Because the true people of God aren't the people who share Abraham's DNA. It's the people who share Abraham's faith and who are faithful to God. And so God's people, it's not like God has an obligation to everyone who has Jewish blood. He chooses to be in covenant relationship with all who have faith in Jesus Christ, who have Abraham's faith, both people of Jewish heritage and Gentiles who by faith are grafted in to the true people of God. That's the first reason why I don't think this list is literal Israelites. I promised you 2 other reasons. Here's the second one. In the Old Testament, there's 27 times where there are lists of the tribes of Israel. I thought about making a chart and putting it on the screen, but then that felt a little overwhelming, so I won't do that. But you can go find some commentaries, and you can see all 27 lists. Here's the interesting thing. None of them are the same. They're all in slightly different order. And did you know that this list in Revelation 7 is, again, different than all the other lists? You're like, how is it different? Well, typically the list of the tribes would begin with the firstborn son. That's Reuben. But this list begins with Judah. Now, why would that happen? Because Jesus is the lion of the tribe of Judah. And Jesus is most prominent among Abraham's descendants. A lot of the tribe lists in the Old Testament excluded the tribe of Levi because priests were not allowed to participate in war. But God's people in Revelation chapter 5 have become a kingdom of priests. And we participate in war against Satan because of our witness. So Levi's back in because we're the priestly people of God. I mean, you would think that if any of the literal lists from the Old Testament would have been the model for this, if it was supposed to be literal Israelites, they would have used the list from Ezekiel 48 because that was kind of an end times list. But it's not even in line with that one either. it's a clue that this is about the church pictured as end times Israel. Here's the last reason. This kind of gets super practical, and it goes back to the nation of Israel. So you remember your Israel history, right? We had King David, and then we had King Solomon, and this was when Israel was at its peak. But remember, after King Solomon, his son Rehoboam was kind of a bum, and so he was like, hey, good idea, let's tax the people more, and that went over about as well as raising taxes now. And so the nation had a civil war and split into two. Do you remember this? And there was a northern kingdom, and there was a southern kingdom. And so the northern kingdom kept the name Israel, and 10 of the tribes went with them to get away from the crazy king who wanted to tax them. And then the southern kingdom kept the capital city, Jerusalem, but they were called Judah. Well, the northern kingdom was conquered first, went into exile first, like 150 or so years before the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was conquered by Assyria, and the people were hauled off, many of them to Assyria. But Assyria and Babylon ended up treating their captives very differently. In fact, Babylon didn't last super long, and Persia became the ruling dominant empire. And you remember Cyrus, right, who sent people back to Israel, and they rebuilt the temple. And there's this great, thing about how the exile lasted 70 years and God restored his people. But those people who came back, and we read about that in the book of Haggai when they built that new temple, those people were only from the 2 southern tribes that represented Judah. The 10 northern tribes from Israel that Assyria hauled away, like Assyria's policy was just to spread them all out, make them all intermarry, and they're all going to disappear as a people group. And so the 10 northern tribes have basically been lost to history. In fact, really interesting quote about this by an ironically named professor named Mr. Marcus Boring. I know, right? Like, imagine being like, yeah, I have Revelation class with Dr. Boring. But he wrote this. He wrote, quote, Judaism knew that the original unity of 12 tribes had been disrupted by the Assyrian deportation and had never been restored. But at the end time, God would reassemble the full complement of all Israel. John declares that the end times hope for Israel is realized in the church. So here's my argument. The 10 tribes were basically lost to history. So if you're going to argue that this is a literal list, well, you have to make arguments like, you could make the Elizabeth Warren argument. Do you know what I mean by that? Do you remember this? Like a few years ago, there was big drama with Elizabeth Warren, and Donald Trump was kind of making fun of her and calling her Pocahontas because she's like, Elizabeth Warren said that she was the first Native American professor at Harvard. And people were looking at her, and they're like, girl, you're whiter than the marshmallow fluff cream in my pantry. So like, how are you the first Native American professor at Harvard? And so she ends up running a DNA test. Do you guys remember this? And the DNA test is like, well, you have like maybe 1/512th or 1/1024th Native American blood in you. And is that sufficient for the claim she made to be of Cherokee descent? And here's my thing. If you're going to be among those who'll be like, yeah, that feels a little weak, you're talking like mega more generations removed to claim that people who were lost 2,700 years ago in the Assyrian invasion of Israel are the actual 10 tribes, literally. That argument just doesn't seem to work. I mean, I guess you could argue that like there's 12,000 of these literal people from each tribe hiding in a cave somewhere that have been lost to history, but satellite imagery and world travel being what it is, that feels a little far-fetched. Or I guess you could argue that God will miraculously restore the DNA that's been lost 2,700 years ago, and that's the only argument that you can make if you want to argue that these are literal people that makes any sense to me. But even then, you're positing a miracle, and I feel like it just makes more sense in light of all the factors we've seen to say that these are all of us, God's priestly people, everyone who belongs to Jesus Christ. So let's talk about this seal. It says we'll be sealed on the forehead. There are some who suggest that sealing is a mark of ownership, like how first century slaves got branded or tattooed. But here's the thing about that. Branding and tattooing of slaves in the first century was a different Greek word than what was used here in Revelation 7. And the only slaves who got branded and tattooed were runaways or those who had committed a crime so severe that they needed to be punished. They would brand you, and that branding would symbolize you're a slave for life, and those who are branded could never earn their freedom. That doesn't feel like how God would seal his people, some type of punishment branding. No, I think this sealing goes back to the book of Exodus, where the priests had a special seal on their forehead. We read about this in Exodus chapter 28, when we read about the garments that the priests would wear. It says it will be on Aaron's forehead. In fact, I think that this seal is better defined by the book of Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. In Song of Songs, it says this: "Set me as a seal on your heart, for love is as strong as death." God's seal is his seal of love that he puts on us. God's like, I'm setting you apart, not as a slave, but as a beloved son and daughter, as a beloved child of the King. So when the earth goes crazy around you, my love will sustain you. You've been marked by belonging to God. In fact, there's two different marks in the book of Revelation. Did you know this? God's people have God's name written on their foreheads. In chapter 13, Satan, through his beast and false prophet, will parody this with the mark of the beast that will be written on the foreheads of unbelievers. But in Greek, they actually use two different words. The mark that God's people receive and the mark that the beast people receive are different marks. God's people receive the sphragas, the beast people receive the charagma. Now, you don't need to know the Greek words. The point is that they're different. And here's the thing. Revelation is making very clear that there's no neutral ground. A lot of us, if we see a conflict going on, are like, you know what, I'm going to hang back on the sidelines until I see who's going to win. And Revelation's like, you can't hang back on the sideline. You got to choose a side. Because everybody belongs to someone. All people are marked by a mark. The question is not, will you be marked? The question is, which mark will you wear? Will you belong to God? Will you devote your life to Jesus Christ and be part of those who live on witness for Jesus Christ? Or will you be part of those who belong to the beast? Will you love the world, the things in this world? Or will you love God? So why do we get God's seal? Our third and final point. Sealing preserves God's people through judgment. The key Old Testament background verse for this is in Ezekiel chapter 9. Did you know in Ezekiel chapter 9, God sent an angel of death through Jerusalem? It's not a story that we talk about a lot in church. It didn't really make the flannograph in Sunday school because that'd just be kind of mean, right, to show an angel just like zapping people. But check this out. In Ezekiel chapter 9, before the angel of death starts his death-bringing march through Jerusalem, the Lord speaks to him, pass through the city of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the detestable practices committed in it. Isn't that amazing? Like before the death thing starts, there are people who are sealed off, and it's like put a seal on them so that you'll know not to touch them. The judgment's for the other people, not for them. Then he spoke to the others and said, pass through the city after him and start killing. Don't show pity. I mean, what a crazy thing. Start with the old, the children, the old, like nobody's going to be left. But then it says this, don't come near anyone who has the mark. That's the Old Testament precedent. Don't come near anyone who has the mark with your death and judgment. So how does that play out in Revelation? Here's how it plays out. We got to make a really clear distinction between two words in Revelation. It makes all the difference. There's tribulation and there's wrath. Tribulation is for everyone. The Bible tells us as Christians we're going to face tribulation. Revelation 2:10. The hour of tribulation is coming upon us, and it tells us it's only going to be for a short time. It says it's going to last like for 10 days. It's tribulation. It's the unbelieving world with its last gasps of sin and the suffering it brings. And all the sickness and the sorrow and the tension, we're going to walk through that. But you know what we're not going to walk through is the wrath of God. We're marked out so the wrath of God won't touch us. Our witness carries us through tribulation. But when God comes to intervene and he brings his wrath against the wickedness on earth, that wrath is for our good, because that wrath is cleaning out the junk so that the earth can be purified, so that we can have a place to live with God forever. What Eden was supposed to be, the new heavens and the new earth will be. And God in his wrath will clean out all the rebellion, all the wickedness. And it won't touch us because we've been sealed. We've been sealed as those who have an RSVP ticket on our foreheads. We're bound for the promised land. We're going to live in the new creation with the Lord forever. We're part of God's army. The church who with our witness is fighting against Satan. And Satan's got one strategy. Here's Satan's strategy. Get you to defect. That's Satan's only goal. Get you to defect. Love the world or something else more than you love God. We're like, no, I'm going to cling to my witness and I'm going to love God more than this world. All the suffering that's coming through Satan, his beasts, his minions, all of it, it's just designed to get you to walk away. But when we stand firm because we're sealed, we show God's ownership in our lives. And the God who saved us is the God who seals us because he's the God who's going to keep us. And you know, it's interesting how this plays out. We mentioned that this is Palm Sunday. You know what I think is so tragic about Palm Sunday? I'm going to close with this thought. Here's what's so tragic about Palm Sunday. The people who welcomed Jesus into the city, waving palm branches and crying Hosanna, were like the same people 5 days later who were standing and shouting, "Crucify him." You're like, how does that happen? That in just a couple days, we go from celebrating Jesus to wanting Jesus dead. And I call it the tragedy of partial commitment. And here's what I mean by that. The people were like all team Jesus as long as they thought Jesus was doing what they thought would bring them blessing short term. And the moment they realized Jesus wasn't about their short-term victory, they turned on him, and they turned on him hard. And church, here's the reality. We're going to go through tribulation short-term, and it's going to be tough. But our hope isn't in the short term. Our hope is in the new heavens and the new earth, the new creation where righteousness dwells. And we're saved for that. And that hope can sustain us no matter what happens around us, because we put our hope in Christ alone. So God, we commit ourselves to you. God, whatever we're facing, you know what those situations are, and it's different for so many of us. God, help us in the midst of that to lock in on our trust in you. Thank you that you've sealed us by the blood of Jesus, that your wrath won't touch us, but that you're preparing for us glory beyond description. We look forward to that, and we hope in you.